The night Georgia Rhodes broke her third nail down to the quick trying to wrench a horseshoe nail free with nothing but a pair of pliers and her own stubborn will. She told herself that this was exactly the kind of thing a woman alone learned to do whether she liked it or not. It was the autumn of 1874, deep in the Colorado Territory, on a small parcel of land that sat at the foot of the San Juan Mountains like a forgotten afterthought. The nearest town of any consequence was Cerro Vista, a rough collection of timber buildings, a general store that smelled of lard and sawdust, a saloon that never fully closed, and a land office that had seen more arguments than any courthouse. Georgia had ridden into Cerro Vista exactly twice since her husband Thomas had died in March, once to register the deed under her own name, and once to buy enough salt pork and cornmeal to last her through May. Both times she had felt the stairs follow her down the single dirt road like heat off a stove plate. Thomas had been dead 7 months now. He had died of a chest fever that moved fast and took no prisoners, and Georgia had sat beside his cot and held his hand until the hand went still, and then she had walked out to the yard and stood in the cold March air and breathed until she could breathe steady again. She was 28 years old. She had no children. She had a 2-room homestead that Thomas had built with borrowed lumber and genuine hope, 40 acres of dry grass land, a cow named Bessie who gave milk begrudgingly, a small vegetable plot that she nursed like it was made of glass, and a bay gelding named Porter who was currently the source of all her misery on this particular October night. Porter had thrown a shoe sometime during the afternoon. Georgia had not noticed until she led him back from the creek at dusk and heard the irregular clop on the hard ground, a sound that made her stomach drop because she knew what it meant. It meant a farrier, and the nearest farrier was 7 miles away in Cerro Vista, and that was a journey she could not make with a horse that was already favoring his left foreleg on the rocky ground between her property and the road. It meant waiting, and waiting meant another day without being able to ride out and check the fence line at the east corner where she'd seen signs of a downed post. It meant, in the particular language of life lived alone on the frontier, one more thing she could not afford to leave unfinished. So she had gone to Thomas's toolbox in the linta beside the barn, and she had pulled out the hoof nippers and the rasp and the box of horseshoe nails, and one of the spare shoes Thomas had kept on a hook for exactly this kind of occasion, and she had brought Porter into the barn and lit the single tin lantern that hung on a nail by the door, and she had told herself she could do this because she had watched Thomas shoe a horse exactly 4 times, and how hard could it really be? The answer, she was discovering, was very hard indeed. The lantern was old and its glass was streaked with smoke, and the light it threw was yellow and unsteady, guttering whenever the night wind pushed through the gaps in the barn boards. Porter was not helping matters. He was a patient animal in most respects, but he had a deep constitutional objection to having his left foreleg held at an angle, and he communicated this objection by shifting his weight in slow, unpredictable arcs that meant Georgia spent as much time rebalancing herself as she did actually working on the shoe. She had managed to clean the hoof and fit the shoe to the right general shape, but now the nailing was defeating her. The nails kept biting wrong, or her angle was off, or Porter would shift and she would have to start over, and the lantern kept throwing tricky shadows into the exact spots where she needed to see most clearly. She was kneeling in the straw with Porter's hoof braced between her knees and a horseshoe nail pinched between her fingers and the lantern hanging above her doing almost nothing useful, and she was thinking very clearly and very specifically about crying, when a voice came from the open barn door. "You want me to hold that light for you?" Georgia's head came up so fast she nearly struck it on Porter's belly. The man standing in the doorway was large. That was the first thing she registered, the sheer volume of him. He stood at least 6 feet and 2 inches, and he was built the way old-growth timber was built, with a width and solidity that spoke of years of hard use and no softness anywhere. His shoulders were broad enough that they nearly touched both sides of the doorframe, and his arms, crossed loosely over his chest, as though he were standing in a general store rather than someone else's barn in the dead of night, were thickly muscled under a worn buckskin coat. His hair was dark brown and long enough to brush his collar, curling slightly at the ends as though it had once been cut properly and had simply decided not to bother again. He had a short dark beard and dark eyes that caught the lantern light steadily. He was not pointing anything at her. He was not moving. He was just standing there with his arms crossed and a look on his face that was not threatening but was very direct, the look of a man who asked exactly one question and waited exactly as long as necessary for the answer. Georgia realized she was still holding the horseshoe nail. She also realized that her hands were shaking slightly, though she chose to attribute that to the cold. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice came out steady, which she was glad of. "Gideon Weston," he said. "I trap lines up in the hills east of here. My camp is about 2 miles that direction." He tilted his head toward the mountain. "I was coming down for water at the creek and I saw your lantern through the trees. Thought I'd check." He paused. "The door was open." "I know the door was open," Georgia said. "It's my door." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Yes, ma'am, I reckoned it was." Georgia looked at him for a long moment. She was a practical woman, and the practical assessment was this. He was twice her size. He had come to her open barn door voluntarily. He had identified himself and explained his presence without being asked twice, and he was offering to hold a lantern rather than anything else. The impractical assessment, the one she shoved aside quickly, was that she had been alone for 7 months, and the sound of another human voice in the dark barn had done something strange and involuntary to her chest. "Fine," she said. "Come in and hold the lantern, but stay on that side of the horse." He came in. He moved quietly for a man his size, which she noted. He lifted the lantern off the nail without being asked and brought it down and held it low and steady at exactly the angle she needed, and the difference was immediate and complete. The hoof was fully illuminated. The nail hole was clear. The shadows were gone. "Thank you," Georgia said, and she meant it more than she wanted to. "You want to drive the nail at about that angle," Gideon Weston said, not instructing her exactly, more like mentioning something to the air between them. "Bit more toward the toe." Georgia adjusted. The nail bit clean. She drove it true and the shoe seated firm against the hoof wall. "Good," he said. She finished the remaining nails without another word from him. Just the steady yellow glow of the lantern held exactly where she needed it. And Porter, as though he understood that something had improved in the general situation, stopped shifting and stood like he was carved from stone. When she finally let Porter's hoof down and straightened up, her back ached and her knees were stiff from the straw and her fingers were dark with hoof dirt and horseshoe oil. She wiped her hands on her work apron and looked at the man standing across the horse from her. He was looking at her with a kind of frank, steady attention that was not rude but was entirely unguarded, and it made her feel seen in a way she was not accustomed to. "Georgia Rhodes," she said, because he had given his name and it seemed fair. "Ma'am," he said, and he touched the brim of the hat he was not wearing, an automatic gesture, and seemed faintly startled to find his head bare. He must have pulled it off when he stepped inside. It was tucked now under his left arm. "You said you trap lines up in the hills," Georgia said. She was leading Porter to his stall, and the conversation was a reason to keep moving, to give her hand something to do. "How long have you been up there?" "This season since August," Gideon said. He hung the lantern back on its nail and watched her settle Porter with the ease of long habit. "I winter in Cerro Vista usually. Pick up work where I can. In spring I go back up." "You do that alone?" "Yes." "That's a hard life," Georgia said. She said it without pity, just as a statement of fact, and he received it in exactly that spirit. "It suits me," he said. "Most things up there are simpler than down here." There was something in the way he said it that made her think he did not mean simpler as in easy. She thought he meant simpler as in honest, and that was a distinction she understood well enough. She latched Porter's stall and turned to face him properly. He was still standing near the door, hat in hand, and despite his size there was nothing aggressive in his posture. If anything, he seemed very careful with his size, the way a man who has always been large learns to fold himself inward so he does not alarm people. "I can offer you coffee," she said. "It's late and you walked 2 miles out of your way to hold my lantern. The least I can do." He looked at her for a moment as though weighing something. "I won't say no to coffee," he said. They walked across the dark yard to the house, and she lit the oil lamp on the table and put the coffee pot on the iron stove, and they sat across from each other at her plain pine table. And it was the first time in 7 months that Georgia Rhodes had sat across from another living person in her own kitchen. And she felt it the way you feel the sun when it comes out in the middle of a cold day. A warmth that arrives before you're ready for it. She told him about Porter and the thrown shoe in the afternoon, and he asked about the terrain between the barn and the creek, and nodded at her answer as though filing it away. She learned that he had been trapping beaver and mink in the upper drainage for the past 2 months, and that he had a line camp up near the tree line, where a previous trapper had built a rudimentary but sturdy shelter. He spoke in economical sentences, the way a man who spent most of his time alone spoke, not unfriendly but unused to ornamentation. His eyes, though, were expressive in a way his words were not. When she said something that struck him as sharp or clever, they warmed slightly. When she mentioned Thomas, just briefly, just in passing, just to explain that she was managing the property alone, they went careful. "I'm sorry about your husband," Gideon said. "Thank you," Georgia said. And then, because she was tired and because the coffee was good and because it was very late and the walls between the kind of conversation you had in daylight and the kind you had at midnight had grown thin, she said, "He was a good man. He was not always suited for this land, but he was a good man." Gideon looked at his coffee cup. "That's an honest thing to say." "I try to be honest," Georgia said. "I noticed," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth moved fully into a smile, and it changed his face completely, made him look younger and less weathered and like someone who laughed more often than anyone who encountered him might guess. He left an hour after midnight, with his hat back on his head and his lantern, for he had brought his own lantern apparently, in hand. He paused at her door and said he would look in on her again before he came down for winter, if she had no objection. Georgia stood in the doorway with the cold coming in around her, and said that she had no objection. She watched his lantern bob away through the dark until the trees took it, and then she went inside and sat at the table for a long time without pouring herself any more coffee. He came back 4 days later. It was a morning this time early, the sky just starting to lighten in the east, and she was out at the woodpile splitting logs for the week when she heard hooves on the track and looked up to see him coming through the pines on a dark roan horse that was heavily packed with trapping gear. He raised a hand when he saw her, and she raised her axe in acknowledgement, and he rode up to the edge of the woodpile and stopped. "Thought I would check the fence line with you," he said without preamble. "You mentioned a down post on your east side." Georgia straightened and set the axe. She looked at him. He looked back at her, large and steady in the saddle with the mountains behind him white at their crowns with early snow. "You came 2 miles down out of the hills to check a fence post," she said. "I was coming this direction anyway," he said. This was, she was fairly certain, a lie. She decided to let it stand. "I'll get Porter," she said. They spent the better part of the morning fixing 3 fence posts on the east line, Gideon doing the heavier work with the post-hole digger and the tamping iron, while Georgia kept the line taut and drove the staples. He worked the way he moved, with an unhurried efficiency that covered a great deal of ground without appearing to hurry. By the time the sun was fully up, and the autumn air had that cold, bright quality that felt like clarity, they had repaired what would have taken Georgia 2 full days alone to fix. She made him breakfast afterward. Biscuits and salt pork and fried eggs from the 2 hens she kept, and more coffee, and they ate at the same pine table, and the conversation came more easily this time, less measured, more like 2 people who had already agreed on the general terms of acquaintance. She learned that he was 32, that he had come west from Ohio when he was 19 and had worked as a teamster and then a scout and then a trapper, and that the mountains suited him better than anywhere else he had been. That he had no family living, his parents gone and a brother who had gone to the war in 1862 and not come back. That he had been in the Colorado Territory for 6 years. She told him about coming out from Tennessee with Thomas in 1869, newlyweds with a wagon and a land claim, and the particular reckless optimism of people who had decided that the future was somewhere west of where they stood. That Thomas had been a farmer's son from outside Knoxville who wanted land of his own. That she had been a schoolteacher's daughter who had read too many accounts of the West and romanticized it thoroughly, and was then surprised when the reality was rocky soil and brutal winters and the long, particular silence of a frontier homestead. "Do you regret it?" Gideon asked. Georgia thought about it seriously, which was how she thought about most things. "No," she said. "It's mine now, the land. I understand it differently than Thomas did. I think I may have been better suited to it all along and just needed time to find that out." He nodded slowly. "Some places take a person that way," he said. "They ask you to prove yourself before they let you belong. Is that what the mountains did to you?" He looked out the window at the peaks, which were visible from her kitchen window, a sweeping line of rock and snow and timber that was impossible not to look at. "Something like that," he said. He came back again a week later and then again the week after that. He was always busy, always useful, and he was scrupulous about the fact of the usefulness, as though the physical work were the only legitimate reason for him to be there, as though without the fence post or the water trough repair or the firewood he had brought down from the timber 2 weeks before winter, he would not have a justification for the sitting at the table and the talking and the way she laughed when he said something dry, and the way he watched her when she wasn't looking. Georgia was not oblivious to the watching. She was also not unaware of her own particular response to his arrival, the way her morning had a different quality on the days she thought he might come, the way she found herself paying attention to the direction of the pines along the eastern track. She was practical about this too, tried to be. She was a widow 8 months out. She had a homestead to manage. She did not have the luxury of being swept up in anything. And yet he had held the lantern steady for the full hour she'd spent shoeing porter, and that was not a small thing. She had lived 5 years with Thomas, whom she had loved genuinely and grieved honestly, and she could not recall a single moment when Thomas had simply held the light without needing to also demonstrate that he could do the thing better. Gideon Weston had held the light and let her do the work, and said exactly one useful thing, and kept the rest to himself. And something about that particular restraint had gotten inside her in a way she was still trying to account for. The first time he touched her was an accident of proximity. It was the 3rd week of October, and she was on a ladder nailing tar paper to the gap in the barn roof where the winter wind was starting to come through, and the ladder shifted on the uneven ground and she grabbed the roofline and held on, and in the time it took her to register that she was stable, his hands were on the ladder and on her waist, large and certain, steadying from below. "I've got the ladder," he said. "I noticed," she said, and her voice came out more breathless than she wanted. She finished the patch and came down the ladder with his hands no longer on her waist, but his steadying presence still warm in the air between them. And when her feet hit the ground she turned, and he was right there, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. And there was something in his face that was entirely stripped of his usual careful neutrality. Something that looked, she thought, like a man standing at the edge of a place he very much wanted to go and holding himself back by main force of will. "Georgia," he said. "Don't say anything that you'd take back," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. "I wouldn't take it back," he said. "That's the whole problem." She looked at him for a long time in the cold October air, with the barn behind her and the mountains beyond him and the sky overhead running out of daylight, and she said, "Come inside." They had coffee again, and they talked for a long time, and the talking was different this time, stripped of the careful social architecture of their previous conversations, more direct and more careful at the same time. She asked him plainly if he intended to stay in Cerro Vista through the winter, and he said he did. She asked him what he intended to do through the winter, and he said he had been thinking he might find more permanent work, something that kept him on one stretch of land longer than a trapping season. His eyes on her face were steady and dark and entirely clear about what he was saying without saying it. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what you mean," Georgia said. "I know you won't," he said. "That's one of the things." "What are the things?" she asked. He thought about it. He was not a man who answered quickly when the answer mattered. "The way you work," he said. "The way you think. The way you laughed the first night when you said that about the lantern throwing shadows in exactly the wrong place, like the lantern was being personally contrary. The way you said Thomas was a good man but not suited to the land, because you could have said something that made you sound better than that and you didn't." He paused. "The way you shoed that horse in the dark by yourself because you decided you could do it and you weren't going to give up even though the nail kept biting wrong." George's throat was tight. "I was making a mess of it," she said. "You would have gotten there," he said simply, and she believed him. She set her coffee cup down. "I have not been anything but a widow for 8 months," she said, "and I do not want to move too quickly into something because the winter is coming and it is easier not to be alone. That is not what I want." "That's not what this is," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I've been alone for 10 years," he said, "and easy is not what this feels like." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. The oil lamp was burning low and the October wind was finding its way through every gap in the walls and the coffee had gone cold. And Georgia Rhodes, who was practical and honest and who did not let herself want things she could not name, felt something open in her chest like a door in a house she had thought was fully locked. "Come to Cerro Vista in November," she said. "Get your winter work. I will see you there." He came down from the mountains in the first week of November with his season's catch packed, and a quiet steadiness about him that she recognized when she saw him across the main street of Cerro Vista on a cold, gray Tuesday. He was selling his furs to the trading post, the lean figure of the proprietor, a man named Harlan Peck, leaning over a rough table of pelts with the practiced skepticism of someone who had been shorting trappers for 20 years. Georgia was coming out of the general store with her monthly supplies, and she stopped on the boardwalk and watched. She watched Gideon Weston stand his full height across the table from Harlan Peck and speak in a voice too low to hear, and not move an inch. And she watched Harlan Peck recalculate something on his ledger and write a different figure. And she thought that she was very glad she had not needed to negotiate anything with Harlan Peck alone, because she had tried it once in September and it had not gone well. And the particular injustice of a man like that deciding her goods were worth less than they were, because she was a woman doing business without a man beside her, was something she carried like a stone in her boot. Gideon looked up and saw her on the boardwalk, and the transaction at the table was finished in 30 seconds flat. He came across the street to her with his long stride and stopped at the bottom of the boardwalk steps and looked up at her. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. She paused. "Did Peck give you a fair price?" "Fairer than he wanted to," Gideon said, and that corner of the mouth smile was there and gone. She had come to Cerro Vista intending to stay one night at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Clara Hastings, a practical woman of 50 who had been running the most respectable establishment in town for 15 years, and who had specific, articulated opinions about everything, and kept excellent coffee on the stove at all times. Georgia had stayed there before, and Mrs. Hastings had been kind to her in the direct, non-pitying way that Georgia appreciated. Gideon had a room at the same boarding house, a coincidence that was entirely not a coincidence since there was only the one boarding house, and it was the only establishment in Cerro Vista that a person of any standards would choose to stay in. Mrs. Hastings fed them dinner at the same long table with 4 other boarders, a mining surveyor and his assistant, an itinerant preacher passing through, and a young woman named Alice Fontaine who was waiting for her family to come from Kansas, and who spent most of dinner looking anxious and sad. Georgia talked to Alice Fontaine for a long time after dinner about the specifics of the terrain between Cerro Vista and the Kansas border, and what provisions Alice's family might need. And Gideon sat at the end of the table and listened and refilled the coffee cups and said nothing, but was entirely present. And Mrs. Hastings watched the whole tableau with the expression of a woman who had seen a great deal of life and found this particular iteration of it pleasing. Later, after the other boarders had gone up and the kitchen was quiet, Georgia and Gideon sat at Mrs. Hastings's table again, and Mrs. Hastings herself had gone to bed with the careful noisiness of someone making a point of their absence, and they talked in the low, comfortable way of people who have been looking forward to talking. "She is going to be all right, Alice Fontaine," Georgia said. "Her family will come." "You don't know that," Gideon said. "No," Georgia said, "but I told her what I knew, and knowing the practical thing is better than not knowing it." "You were kind to her." "She was frightened," Georgia said. "That is not a complicated situation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been thinking about the east side of your property." She looked at him. "Have you?" "There's a good spring up on the slope above your east fence line," he said. "I came past it last month when I was running my upper line. It runs clean year-round. If you had a pipe laid down from that spring to your yard, you would not have to carry water from the creek in the worst of winter." Georgia was still. She turned this over. The creek in deep winter was a trouble, ice and distance, and the labor of carrying it, one of the dozen small miseries of a homestead in the mountains. "That is a significant amount of work," she said. "I know," he said. "I have time this winter." "You said you were going to find work," she said. "I am also good with pipe," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Gideon," she said. "Georgia," he said. "You cannot spend your winter being useful at my property," she said. "People will talk." "People are already talking," he said without embarrassment. "I heard 2 different conversations in the Trading Post today." This was probably true. Cerro Vista was small, and its residents were interested in each other's affairs in the way that people who live close together and have few distractions tend to be. A mountain man who had been spending his autumn months at a widow's homestead was not an invisible fact. "What were they saying?" Georgia asked. "One of them seemed to think I was planning to take your land from you," Gideon said. "The other seemed to think you were planning to take my trapping income." He paused. "Neither of them seemed to consider that 2 people might simply want to be in the same place." George's mouth curved. "And what do you want to say when they ask you?" He looked at her steadily. "I want to say that I intend to court you properly if you will allow it," he said, "and that what comes of it is our business." There it was. The clean, direct thing. The way he spoke when he had decided something was worth saying plainly. She felt it land with the particular weight of words that had been held carefully for a while before being released. "All right," she said. "You can lay that pipe from the spring." He blinked. Then the smile came full this time, and it lit his face the way she had been hoping it would. "I'll need your help with the grade calculation," he said. "I can do arithmetic," she said. "I know you can," he said. "That's why I'm asking." The winter that came to the San Juan Mountains in 1874 came hard and early, the way it did some years, arriving before Thanksgiving with 3 feet of snow in the high passes, and a cold that settled into the valleys like something with intentions. George's property was at a difficult elevation, high enough to catch the full weight of the mountain winter, but not so high that the cold was simply expected and prepared for. The creek froze in early December. The water from Gideon's pipe, which they had spent the better part of November laying in sections down the rocky slope and across her yard to a collection point near the barn, ran faithfully through the worst of it, and Georgia stood at her kitchen window on the coldest mornings and felt a gratitude for the sound of running water that was close to the feeling you had in church. Gideon had taken a permanent room at Mrs. Hastings's boarding house for the winter, which was 3 miles from Georgia's property by the track. He came to the property 3 or 4 times a week and always in daylight, and he was correct and careful about propriety in a way that she understood was his effort to protect her reputation in a place where her reputation was a practical asset she could not afford to lose. He brought firewood and repairs, and once in mid-December, he brought a haunch of venison from a hunt he had done up on the ridge, and they spent an entire afternoon and evening cooking it together in her small kitchen, the windows steaming with the heat of the fire and the smell of the meat and the herbs she grew in pots on the sill. And they talked the way they had learned to talk, easily and honestly, and with long, comfortable silences that felt like the spaces in good music. He stayed for dinner that night, and they ate by lamplight with the snow coming hard against the windows, and afterward she washed the plates and he dried them, and she was aware the whole time of how close they were in the small kitchen, aware of the size of him and the warmth of him and the particular quality of his care, the way he handled her plain tin plates like they were something worth handling carefully. When he was putting on his coat to leave, he said, "You could come into town for Christmas. Mrs. Hastings does a proper dinner." "I know she does," Georgia said. "I'll come." He stopped with his coat half on. "You will." "I said so," she said. She was smiling and she knew it. He finished putting on his coat, settled his hat, picked up his lantern. He stood at her door for a moment, and she was at the table and the distance between them was small. "Georgia," he said, and his voice had gone quiet. "Yes," she said, because she knew what he was asking. He crossed the room in 2 steps, and he cupped her face in both his large hands with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with his size, and he kissed her. And it was the first time anyone had kissed her in 8 months, and it was warm and careful and unambiguous. A kiss that said everything his economy of words had been not quite saying for the past 2 months, and she put her hands on the front of his coat and held on for a moment before he drew back. "That is the first thing I've done today that didn't need doing," he said. "Then you needed to do it," she said. He left with his lantern, and she stood at her window and watched him go. And this time the lantern moving away through the snow did not feel like a subtraction. Christmas at Mrs. Hastings's was a revelation in the best possible sense. The boarding house had a long dining room that Mrs. Hastings had decorated with pine branches and candles, and a string of red ribbon that she had apparently been reusing for 15 years, and she had cooked enough food for a company of cavalry. There were 12 people at the table, including the 4 regular boarders, Alice Fontaine, who had not yet been collected by her family, and who had by now been entirely adopted by Mrs. Hastings as a project, a family of 3 from the neighboring farm who had come in from their property to avoid eating Christmas alone, and a young couple named the Garlands who had married in September and were spending their first holiday in a town that was still strange to them. Georgia sat beside Gideon at that long table and felt the warmth of the room and the noise of people eating and talking and laughing at Mrs. Hastings's dry jokes, and she thought that she had almost forgotten what it was like to be among people who were not strangers, who were, if not family exactly, then something adjacent to family, the kind of temporary community that the frontier made. After dinner, Gideon produced from somewhere in his coat a small wrapped package that he set in front of her without ceremony. "Gideon," she said. "It is Christmas," he said. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, beautifully made, the leather soft and the stitching fine. She looked at them for a moment and then looked at him. "I know you do a great deal of work in the cold," he said. "You made these," she said, because she recognized the stitching style from the work he had done on his own gear. "I had the winter," he said. She had not brought him anything because she had not known he would bring her something, and the lopsidedness of that bothered her more than was reasonable. She told him so. "Georgia," he said, patient as the mountain behind him, "you have been feeding me dinner for 2 months. That is not the same as—" "It is exactly the same," he said, and the firmness in his voice was gentle but absolute, and she let it stand because he was right and she knew it. She wore the gloves out to Porter's stall that evening when she checked on him before the ride home, and they fit perfectly, which meant he had measured them somehow, probably against the work gloves she left on the post by the barn door, and the thought of him doing that quietly and without announcement made something in her chest ache with a sweetness she did not entirely know what to do with. January was the hardest month. It was always the hardest month in the mountains. the time when the winter stopped being a novelty or a challenge and became simply a relentless physical fact that required daily management. The snow was deep, and the cold was deep, and every task took twice as long and used twice the energy. Georgia had been through 5 Colorado winters, 4 of them with Thomas, and she knew the rhythms of it, knew when to conserve and when to push through. But this year the isolation was sharper, or perhaps she had simply grown unaccustomed to it in the months she had been not alone, and the days that Gideon did not come felt longer than they used to. She did not tell him this. She did not think it was a thing that needed to be said. He came on the coldest day of the month, a January afternoon when the temperature had dropped so severely that the air itself seemed solid, the sky white and absolute, and the snow squeaking underfoot with the particular sound of extreme cold. He came with the roan horse and a sledge he had borrowed from Mrs. Hastings's husband's old equipment, loaded with enough split wood to last her the month, and when she opened the door and saw him, she felt something that she could only call relief, so profound it was nearly embarrassing. "You didn't have to make a special trip," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I know I didn't," he said. She took his coat and hung it and made coffee, and they sat with their cups and the fire going strong and the cold pushing against every wall, and she said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" he said. "About what happens in March," she said, "when the trapping season starts again." He looked at her. He was quiet. "You will go back up to the mountains," she said. "That is your life. I don't want you to think that I expect—" She stopped, tried again. "I don't want you to feel that because of what has happened between us, you are obligated to—" "Georgia," he said. "Let me finish," she said. He let her finish. She said what she had been thinking, that she cared for him very much and that she did not want the caring to become something that changed what he was or what he needed, that she had watched Thomas grow unhappy when the land did not give him what he expected of it, and she was not interested in watching another person she cared for be diminished by mismatched expectations. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "Are you asking me to go?" "No," she said immediately. "Are you asking me to stay?" She was quiet. "Because if you are asking," he said, and his voice was very careful with it, the care of a man who knew that what he said next had real weight, "then I want to tell you that I have been thinking the same thing since October, since the first night, since you told me to hold the lantern and you drove those nails in the dark like you had been doing it your whole life." He set down his coffee cup. "I do not want to go back up in March and leave this. I do not want to go back up at all if this is here." "Gideon," she said softly, "I have $40 from this season's furs," he said. "That's not wealth, I know that, but I know land. I know animals and water and timber and how to read a winter, and I know that your east pasture could carry twice the cattle you are running if the grass was managed right, and I know that the spring I piped down would support a kitchen garden year-round with the right system." He paused. "I know that I have been happier sitting at your table these past 3 months than I have been anywhere I have been in the last 10 years, and I am not a man who says things like that easily." George's eyes were bright. She kept them level. "No," she said, "you are not. So I am asking you plainly," he said, "what do you want?" She looked at him across the pine table in the small warm kitchen with the cold pressing in from every side and the fire in the stove throwing its steady heat. And she thought about Thomas, who had been good and gone. And she thought about the lantern in the barn on that first October night, held steady and true by hands that were not hers. And she thought about the fact that she had been afraid for a long time, not of the land or the winter or the work, but of wanting something too much. Of being wrong about someone the way you could be wrong about the land, expecting it to be something other than what it was. But she had been watching Gideon Weston for 3 months. She knew what he was. "I want you to stay," she said. The proposal happened on a Tuesday in February, which was not a romantic day by any conventional measure, but it happened in the way that things between them happened, which was directly and without excessive decoration. He came to the property, and they spent the morning checking the cattle and the afternoon repairing the kitchen window seal. And in the early evening, when she was setting bread to rise and he was at the table with his coffee, he said, "I want to ask you to marry me." She kept her hands in the dough. "Then ask," she said. "Georgia Rhodes," he said, "I want to marry you. I want this to be mine the way it is yours, the work of it and the cold of it and the spring of it and every year after. I want to be the man who holds the lantern when you need the light, and I want to work this land with you for as long as you'll have me." He paused. "Will you have me?" She turned from the counter with flour on her hands and looked at him, and he was standing now, hat off, and he looked more uncertain than she had ever seen him, this solid, capable, self-contained man undone by the prospect of hearing no. "Yes," she said. The relief that moved through him was visible, a slow unclenching like a fist opening. He crossed the room and took her flour-covered hands in his large ones and held them for a moment, and then he bent and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she tasted coffee and winter air and the particular warmth of a man who has been holding himself in check for a long time. "You have flour on you now," she said against his mouth. "I know it," he said. They were married in April, when the snow had pulled back up the slopes, and the lower meadows were green with the particular tender green of early spring, in the small Cerro Vista church by a Methodist minister named Reverend Cole, who performed the ceremony with a brisk efficiency that suggested he had done this a great many times and was glad to do it again. Mrs. Hastings was there, and Alice Fontaine, whose family had finally arrived in March and who had come back to the wedding with something of the young woman she apparently was under the anxiety, a girl of 19 with dark eyes and quick laughter who stood beside Georgia and seemed genuinely happy. The mining surveyor was there, and the Garlands, and a number of people from town whose names Georgia knew and whose faces she recognized, people who had watched her manage the property alone and who had opinions about Gideon Weston that were, as far as she could tell, largely favorable. He was known in the area as a straight dealer and a man who was reliable, the kind of reputation that carried weight in a place where character was one of the few currencies that never inflated. Harlan Peck was there, which she had not expected, and he shook Gideon's hand with the slightly defeated look of a man who has recalculated several things and accepted the new math. Georgia shook his hand too and looked him in the eye, and he had the grace to look away first. The wedding dinner was at Mrs. Hastings's, naturally, and it lasted through the evening and into the early night, and when Georgia and Gideon finally rode out from Cerro Vista together in the spring dark with the stars overhead in their full mountain abundance, she was aware of the completeness of it, the sense of a circle fully drawn. "Mrs. Weston," Gideon said as they rode. "Don't start," she said, but she was smiling. "I'm told it's traditional," he said. "I am keeping Rhodes," she said. "Georgia Rhodes Weston, that is who I am." "That is exactly who you are," he said, and meant it as a compliment, and she took it as one. The spring and summer of 1875 were the best and hardest working months of Georgia's life. They were best because they were shared, because the labor of the homestead that had been isolating when it was hers alone became something different when it was divided and multiplied between two people who worked well together. Gideon was everything he had said he would be, and more than that. He had a practical intelligence that was uncertified by any institution, but was as thorough as any she had encountered. He knew cattle and pasture management, and he had been right about the East Pasture, which they expanded and reseeded in May, and which by July was carrying 8 more head than the previous year. He knew water and land and timber and weather, and he knew them in the bone-deep way of a man who had spent years in terrain that did not forgive ignorance. He also, she discovered, could read. Not just functionally but genuinely, and he had a habit, in the evenings when the work was done, of reading whatever she had on the small shelf of books she kept above the kitchen table, and he read the way he listened, completely and without impatience, and then he had things to say about what he read that made her rethink her own opinions on a regular basis. He read her single copy of a Cooper novel and declared it entertaining but geographically inaccurate. He read the medical almanac she kept for emergencies and memorized what seemed like every relevant section. He was working his way through a worn copy of Thoreau's essays that had come west with her from Tennessee, and they argued productively about Thoreau's ideas on self-reliance in a way that made both of them think. They were hardest because the work was genuinely hard, the physical labor of building something, of turning a homestead that had been held together with Thomas's good intentions and George's stubbornness into something more fully realized. New fence posts and a proper root cellar and an expanded barn, and the cattle management, and the garden, and the daily care of all the living things in their charge. Georgia had never worked so hard in her life, and she had never slept better or eaten better or felt better in her body, which was lean and strong and entirely at home in the high mountain air. She noticed, that summer, that Gideon was always aware of where she was. Not in the way of a man who needed to manage her, not that. In the way of a man who kept a constant compass bearing on the thing that mattered most to him. If she was across the yard, he knew it. If she had gone to the creek, he tracked the direction. When she came back to wherever he was, something in him settled, and she thought that she had probably never been so aware of being known by another person. So precisely and continually seen. She told him once that summer in the way she had of saying difficult things plainly that she was not used to being noticed that constantly and that she was not sure how to feel about it. He thought about that. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "No," she said after checking. "That's what's strange about it." "You were alone a long time," he said. "Before me and before Thomas, and in a different way even during. You got good at not being seen." "I did," she said, and the accuracy of it sat in her for a while. "I'm not going to stop," he said, "but I'll try to be quiet about it." "You are quiet about everything," she said. "Not about this," he said. In the fall of 1875, Georgia found out she was carrying their child. She told him in the kitchen, early morning, with the same directness that characterized all the things she told him. She said she believed she was pregnant, that she was about 2 months along by her reckoning, and that she was not frightened but that she wanted him to know. The look that crossed his face was one she had not seen before, something raw and entirely unguarded, something that was not quite surprise because she thought he had been thinking it possible, but something that was deeper than that, something that was the particular emotion of a man who has built his life alone for so long that the prospect of it not being alone anymore arrives with the force of something he had stopped letting himself expect. He stood up from the table and came to her, and he held her for a long time without saying anything, and she felt the steadiness of him, the solidity, the way he was always exactly as present as he appeared to be. "We should see the doctor in Cerro Vista," he said finally. "I know we should," she said. "I'll take you tomorrow," he said. "You're not taking me anywhere," she said. "I can ride to a doctor." "I know you can," he said. "I want to come with you." She looked up at him. "All right," she said. "You can come." The doctor in Cerro Vista was a recent arrival, a young man named Dr. Fletcher Mears, who had come from Denver in the spring with a medical bag and a determination to be useful on the frontier, and who had rapidly proved himself both competent and discreet. He confirmed Georgia's estimation, and told them what to expect and what to watch for, and gave Gideon a list of things with the steady eye contact of a man who had figured out quickly that this particular husband was the kind who would actually do all of them, which Gideon did. The pregnancy was not easy in the physical sense, because Georgia was not built for easy, and because she had no intention of being anything other than herself regardless of her condition, which meant she continued to work and ride, and do the things that needed doing at a pace that made Dr. Mears slightly concerned, and Gideon carefully measured in his management of his concern. He did not tell her to stop. He simply found ways to be present that made the heavier things unnecessary and made the lighter things easier, and he did it in ways that did not draw attention to the doing of it, and she loved him for that with a specific and articulate gratitude that she told him about. "You don't manage me," she said one evening in November, when she was sitting by the fire with her feet up at his quiet insistence and he was doing the dishes. "I try not to," he said. "You succeed," she said. That is an unusual thing in a man. I reckon, he said. Thomas managed me, she said. It was a thing she had been thinking about, and she said it out loud because she thought he should know. He didn't mean to. But he was always slightly worried about what I was going to do, and so there was always a current of management in everything. I didn't understand it until now, until it's not there. Gideon dried his hands and turned to look at her. What did it feel like, he asked. Like being indoors all the time, she said. Even when I was outside. He nodded slowly. You are the most outdoor person I know, he said. Yes, she said, and laughed, which she was doing more of lately. A richer laugh than she remembered having before, deeper and less guarded. Their son was born in the middle of March 1876, on a day that came in cold and snowy and went out the same way. And the birth was hard and long, and Dr. Mears came out from Cerro Vista in the snow and earned every penny of his fee. Georgia was the bravest person Gideon had ever been in a room with, and he had been in rooms with quite a few people under quite a few circumstances, and he held her hand for 6 hours and said very little and was entirely present, and that was, she told him afterward, the thing she needed most. The baby was dark-haired and strong-lunged and entirely himself from the first moment, and they named him Thomas Gideon Weston. Thomas for the man who had come before and Gideon for the man who was here. And the naming seemed to Georgia to be the right way to account for the whole of her life, both the part that had ended and the part that had begun. Mrs. Hastings came out from Cerro Vista 3 days later with a hamper of food and the look of a woman who had been waiting for this and was very satisfied with how it had turned out. She held the baby with the practiced competence of a woman who had held a great many babies in her time, and said that he had the Weston look about the eyes. He looks like Georgia, Gideon said. He can look like both, Mrs. Hastings said firmly, and that was the end of it. The years that followed the birth of Thomas were full years, the kind of years that pile up in memory not as a blur but as a series of clear images, sharp with specificity. The child who grew up knowing horses the way his parents did, unhesitating and respectful. The cattle herd that grew from the original small stock into something that was beginning to be a genuine ranch, by any honest accounting. The vegetable garden that Georgia expanded each year, until she was selling the surplus in Cerro Vista at fair prices that nobody tried to argue with her about anymore, partly because she was Gideon Weston's wife, and partly because she had, over the years, established herself as a person whose prices were fair by definition. The root cellar that became a proper cellar. The 2-room house that became a 4-room house when Gideon built the addition in 1877, working evenings and weekends through the summer and into the fall, the sounds of his hammering a kind of background music to the household. He did not go back to the mountains in any permanent way. He trapped occasionally in short seasons when the furs were worth it and the timing was right, and he knew every trail and drainage in the high country east of their property with an intimacy that was genuinely useful, a knowledge of the land that he carried in him the way some people carry books. But his axis had shifted. The mountain was still his, the way a place you are deeply native to is always yours, but the homestead was his in a different and equally complete way. The way a choice you have made fully is yours. Georgia watched him settle into the land the way she had settled into it herself, the long, slow process of the land knowing you back. There were mornings when she looked out the kitchen window and saw him in the east pasture with the cattle, a large figure moving with that quiet efficiency through the morning light, and she felt something that was not just love, though it was that thoroughly, but was also recognition. The particular knowledge of a person that comes from years of daily proximity, from having seen them in all conditions, from having been seen. In 1878, she found out she was carrying again. This pregnancy was easier in the body and harder in the mind, because she knew now what the bearing was like, the full measure of it, and the knowledge complicated the anticipation. But Gideon was there the same way, entirely and without reservation, and Dr. Mears had by now delivered enough babies in the territory that he had a calm about him that was genuinely helpful. The second child was a girl. She came in July, in the heat of the mountain summer, and she was different from Thomas in every way that a second child is different, lighter-natured and more social and vocal from the start, someone who seemed to have arrived with opinions about everything. They named her Clara for Mrs. Hastings, who received the news with composure and then went briefly and privately into her kitchen, and was not seen for a few minutes. Thomas, who was 2, was deeply uncertain about the baby for approximately 1 week, and then transferred his entire formidable attention to her in a protectiveness that was identical to his father's, quiet and constant and undeniable. Gideon watched his son watch his sister, and something in his face was absolutely unguarded. "He has your compass," Georgia said. "He has your determination," Gideon said. "He has both," Georgia said. "That's why he's going to be trouble when he is older." He was not trouble. He was serious and careful and good with animals in the way that Gideon was, with the bone-deep patience that the horses and cattle responded to. Clara was the one who was trouble, in the best possible way, the way of a person who is interested in everything and afraid of very little. The winter of 1879 was the winter of the great blizzard that hit the San Juan Range in December, and did not fully release its hold until February, the kind of winter that tested everything and everyone. They were prepared. The cellar was full. The wood was stacked. The cattle were in the extended barn with the hay supply that Gideon had calculated and restocked in November with something that had seemed to Georgia like excess, and revealed itself in February as perfect sufficiency. The pipe from the mountain spring ran under the frozen ground and delivered water throughout, and she was glad, standing at the kitchen counter on the coldest morning of that winter, for the sound of it. Mrs. Hastings came through the blizzard year well, as she came through most things, with practical cheerfulness. Alice Fontaine had married in 1876, a young carpenter from the new township of Ridgecrest who had come to Cerro Vista on a job and met Alice at Mrs. Hastings's table and never quite gotten around to leaving, and they lived now in a house the carpenter had built on the edge of town. And Alice came by the homestead in spring and summer with her own 2 children, and there was a case of genuine friendship between her and Georgia that had grown from the initial kindness of that Christmas dinner into something sturdy and regular. In the spring of 1880, Georgia and Gideon rode together to the east pasture fence line, the same fence they had repaired in that long first autumn, and looked out at the land. It was a morning of brilliant clarity, the sky the deep blue of high altitude, the new grass coming in on the slopes above them, and the cattle moving in the lower meadow in the easy way of animals that are well kept and content. "Do you remember the first time we came out here together?" Georgia said. "October of '74, Gideon said immediately. "You had come down for water," she said. "I had come down because of your lantern in the barn," he said. She looked at him. "You told me you were coming for water." "I know what I told you," he said. She laughed, and it was the full laugh, the one that had deepened and grown richer over the years. "You lied to me in the first week." "I did not want to say I had come specifically because I saw a woman in a barn in the dark fighting with a horseshoe, and I wanted to see if she was all right," he said. "That seemed like a great deal to say to a stranger." "It would have been," she agreed. "I should have said it anyway," he said. She leaned over in the saddle and put her hand over his where it rested on the pommel, and he turned his hand and held hers. "I am glad you held the lantern," she said. "I am glad you let me," he said. The land spread out below them, theirs in every way that mattered, and the mountains rose behind them, and the spring air came down from the high places carrying the cold and the clean of it. And Georgia Rhodes Weston thought about the October night when she had been kneeling in the straw with a horseshoe nail and a guttering lantern and a stubborn horse, and how the stranger in the doorway had not told her to move aside, had not taken over, had not made the task his. He had held the light steady and let her find her angle, and that had been, she understood now, the first true declaration of everything that had followed. They rode back to the house together in the morning light, and Thomas was in the yard with one of the young horses, walking him in circles with a patience beyond his years, and Clara was on the porch steps watching with the expression of someone who was thinking of a better way to do it. The smoke was rising from the chimney in a straight line, which meant the morning was still and clear. Georgia looked at all of it, the yard and the house and the barn and the pipe running down from the mountain and the children and the horse and the man beside her, and felt the full, complete weight of a life that was entirely her own. Not inherited, not given, not managed. Chosen and built and earned day by day and season by season, one nail driven true at a time. "Coffee," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. They put up the horses and went inside, and she put the pot on, and he sat at the pine table that was the same table from the beginning, nicked and stained with the record of years, and she stood at the stove and listened to the children coming in behind them, and the morning opened up the way mornings did in that country, slowly, and with a quality of light that was worth stopping for. There had been a night, not so long ago in the true measure of things, when she had been alone in a barn with a stubborn horse and a dim lantern, and a task she was determined to finish. A night when the cold came through the gaps and the light kept failing and the work kept slipping out of true, and a man had appeared in the door and offered nothing but the steady holding of the light. That was how it had started. That was where the whole of this had begun. She thought it was the best possible beginning. By 1882, Cerro Vista had grown into a proper town, the kind that warranted a schoolhouse. It was Georgia who first raised the issue at a town meeting, standing up in the back of the meeting hall with the direct manner that the town had learned to expect from her, and saying that there were now 43 children in the surrounding area who had no formal schooling, and that this was a practical problem with a practical solution, and that the solution was a schoolhouse with a qualified teacher, and that someone needed to organize it. She organized it. Of course she did. She wrote letters to the Territorial Education Office in Denver and received replies that she forwarded to the town council with annotations, and she solicited funds from the landowners in the area, including a very large contribution from a cattle operation that had recently moved into the valley to the north and whose owner, a man named Archibald Trace, had 4 children and had been thinking the same thing but had not known how to start. Gideon sat in on several of the planning meetings and contributed the architectural knowledge that made the building practical, knowing the conditions of the winters as well as anyone. And the schoolhouse that went up in the spring of 1882 was built to last, with a proper foundation and storm shutters, and a wood stove large enough to heat the room properly. The teacher they found was a young woman from Kansas City named Miss Ruth Alderton, who arrived on the stage in September with a trunk of books and an expression of determined good cheer that aged, in the first month of the Colorado winter, into genuine and tested competence. Georgia liked her immediately. Thomas started school that fall. He was 6, and he applied himself to reading with the same patient thoroughness he applied to everything, and by November he was the best reader in his class, which he seemed not to notice, and which his parents noticed and carefully said nothing about. Clara started the following year at 5, because she had made it very clear that she intended to go to school whether anyone invited her or not, and Miss Alderton had confirmed after a brief assessment that Clara had apparently already taught herself to read from her brother's lessons, and could, if allowed, probably teach half the class herself. "She is very much her own person," Miss Alderton said to Georgia with a tone that was equal parts admiration and caution. "She is," Georgia said. "I encourage it." "I can see that you do," Miss Alderton said, and the admiration won out. It was in the spring of 1883 that Gideon came to Georgia with something he had been sitting with for a while, which was the way he usually arrived at important things, having carried them long enough to know their weight. He had been approached by a man named Dorsey, who was surveying a route for a new road that would connect Cerro Vista to the larger rail junction town of Alamosa to the east, and who needed someone who knew the mountain terrain with the kind of detail that could tell you where a road would hold in winter and where it would not. He had offered Gideon a surveying contract for the spring and summer, good money, the kind that would let them expand the herd and finish the second-room addition that they had been planning. "You want to do it," Georgia said. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I think you want to do it," she said. "I think you've been in this valley for 8 years without spending a full season in the high country, and I think that you are not the kind of man who forgets what he is." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to leave you with all of it," he said. "You will be back by September," she said. "The cattle work in summer is manageable, and the children are old enough to be genuinely useful, which is something I intend to tell them before you leave so they have no choice but to rise to it." She looked at him steadily. "And you will come home on Sundays." "I will come home on Sundays," he said. "Then do it," she said. "You should do it." The relief in him was familiar by now, the unclenching that happened when something he had been holding carefully was received well, and she thought that after 9 years she had still not gotten entirely used to the fact that he needed her opinion, that he did not merely tolerate it but sought it, genuinely, because he trusted her thinking in the way that she trusted his, and that this mutual trust was the load-bearing wall of everything they had built. He came home every Sunday from May to September, riding down from the survey camp in the high passes, with the particular quality of a man who has spent his week in big country, and is very glad of the small, warm world he is returning to. He brought the children rocks he had found up on the ridgeline, interesting formations, a piece of rose quartz for Clara, and a fossil-impressed stone for Thomas that made the boy want to read everything Georgia had that mentioned geology. He brought Georgia the particular information of the high places, the way the spring was moving, the condition of the snowpack, the things that would matter for the valley through the summer and fall, shared in the evening after dinner as they sat on the porch together and watched the last light leave the sky. The road survey was completed in September. The road itself would take 3 more years to build, and when it was finally finished in 1886, the route it took through the mountains was so sound and well considered that it stood for 50 years without significant structural failure, which was the kind of monument Gideon Weston was suited to. In September of 1883, when he came home from the survey for good, he came home to find Georgia standing in the barn with a lantern. He stopped in the doorway. She was checking on one of the young mares who had been off her feed, and the lantern was hanging on the old nail by the door, the same nail from the beginning, and the scene was close enough to the first night that he stood for a moment and let the symmetry of it settle. "Need help," he said. She turned from the mare's stall and looked at him, and 9 years was in that look, the whole of it, every morning and winter and argument and shared meal and sleeping under the same roof through all the weathers that the mountains could devise. "Come hold the lantern," she said. He came in and took it down and held it for her, steady and true, while she checked the mare over, and the barn was warm with the last of the summer heat, and outside the door the September night was clear and full of stars. She finished with the mare and straightened and turned, and he was right there, holding the lantern, looking at her with everything he had ever felt in his face with no architecture around it. "Gideon," she said. "Georgia," he said. She put her hand flat on his chest over his heart and felt the beat of it, steady as everything he did. 9 years, she said. 9 years, he said. "I would do it exactly the same," she said. He put his free hand over hers, holding it against his heart. "So would I," he said. "Every night of it." The lantern threw its warm yellow light across the barn boards, steady and unhurried, the same light it had always been. And the life they had built, season by season and year by year, from the first nail driven true in the dark, went on spreading out before them like the land below the mountains, fully inhabited, wholly theirs, alive in every acre. Thomas would learn to read the mountains the way his father had, and would become, in his own time, a man who moved through high country with the ease of someone native to it. Clara would become a teacher herself, returning after a few years schooling in Denver to the very schoolhouse her mother had organized, A woman of sharp intelligence and warm authority who taught 3 generations of Cerro Vista children to think well. There would be one more child, a second daughter born in 1885 and named Alina, who would be the most musical of the 3, who would somehow convince her parents to acquire a piano in 1891, and who would fill the expanded house with a sound that had never been there before, something purely joyful and entirely new. Mrs. Hastings would live to a vigorous 78 and leave her boarding house to Alice Fontaine's eldest daughter, who ran it with the same practical efficiency and excellent coffee that had characterized it from the beginning. The homestead would become, in time, a genuine working ranch of 400 acres, expanded carefully over the years through purchases from neighboring land that came available, managed with the same daily attention to what the land needed and what it could give that had characterized it from the start. But all of that was later, and the thing that mattered, the root from which everything grew, was the night in October of 1874 when a woman was kneeling in the straw of a barn with a horseshoe nail and a guttering lantern, and a man appeared in the doorway and asked a simple question. And she said yes. And he came in out of the dark and held the light steady and let her do her work. And that was how it began. And everything that came after was exactly as it should have been.